Okay, to answer the question of if we see a relationship that exists between two variables, how can we determine if that relationship is classified as a function? That's what we want to look at here. Now, remember, the definition of a function is every input gives you exactly one output. So you're not going to have a situation where you have an input corresponding to two different outcomes. So let's look at some examples here. This one, we have the x's in the first position here and the y's in the second. Now you can see that every x here corresponds to exactly one y. There's no repeated x. So we would say that y is a function of x, because every x you put in, you get exactly one y out. So y is a function of x. Now, let's look at this one. Notice here, x is 1, y is 3. X is 2, y is 5. X is 1, y is 7. Look at that. You have an x corresponds to 3 here, and it corresponds to 7 here. There are two outputs that correspond to this input of 1. So this one, y is not a function of x. Okay, let's look at this one. Let's see here. We've got 3 corresponds to 4, 2 to 4, 1 to 4, 8 to 4. Now, all the y's are 4s. However, the x's are different. This 3 corresponds to only one number, and that happens to be a 4. This 2 corresponds to one number. That happens to be 4. All the x's correspond to exactly one number. It just happens they're all 4s. So y is a function of x. Okay, let's look at this one. Here we have 1, 2, 1, 8. Now notice 1 corresponds to 2 and 1 corresponds to 3 here. So we've saw one like this before. Y is not a function of x. Okay, now let's go the other way. Let's think about up here, is x a function of y? In other words, now we're going to look at the y as the input. So this is different. So we've got a 3 corresponds to 1, 5 to 2, 7 to 4, negative 2 to 8. So every y corresponds to exactly one x. So x is a function of y. So see, sometimes we can turn it around and we can say, okay, well, let's suppose that y is the independent variable. Okay, we don't have to do x being the independent variable. But anyway, now let's look at this one. 3 corresponds to 1, 5 corresponds to 2, 7 to 1, negative 2 to 8. So notice every y corresponds to exactly one x. So x is a function of y. See? So now let's look at this one. Now we're looking at the y's and seeing if they correspond to exactly one x. 4 corresponds to 3, 4 corresponds to 2. Oh no. No, x is not a function of y. See, if you're asking, is x a function of y, then you look at the y's and you make sure that every y corresponds to only one x. If you're asked, is x a function of y, then you look at the x's and make sure that every x points to only one y. Now look at this one down here. Now we're going to determine, is x a function of y? Well, 2 corresponds to 1, 4 corresponds to 2. Look at this. 4 corresponds to 8, and 4 corresponds to 2. So x is not a function of y. So now this takes a little bit of practice. I went through kind of fast, and you might need to watch this again to really get a handle on what's going on. But that's the approach you take when you're looking at just ordered pairs this way. Now, let's look at some functions or some graphs. Let's suppose we've got y equals x squared, and we're wanting to know, is x a function of y? Well, notice if I go down here on the x-axis and I pick any x value and I go up, notice it hits the graph only once. There is no x that I can choose here that corresponds to more than one y. Every x goes up and hits the graph once. Well, one way we can talk about that is say, well, we can say this graph passes the vertical line test. Every vertical line we draw touches the graph at most once. When that happens, we say y is a function of x. If we go down on the x-axis and draw a vertical line, it touches the graph once. That means y is a function of x. Now, we can look at x cubed. Same situation. It passes the vertical line test. So the vertical line test is what we can use if we want to know, is y a function of x? And notice, any place on the axis, I can go up or down, and I hit the graph once. Okay, now let's look at this one, x equals y squared. Let's see what the graph of that looks like. Now this one definitely is not a function. Y is not a function of x, because look, this x right here corresponds to this y and this y. Now, one of the things, we're not accustomed to seeing things that look like this, x equals y squared. Normally, we're used to seeing y equals something in terms of x. In other words, I would solve this for y. And if I solve this for y, notice I would get y equals plus or minus the square root of x. Well, there you go, plus or minus. So if you put in a 4 for x, you get out a positive 2 and a negative 2. So y is not a function of x. Now here's a circle, and of course it fails the vertical line test. So y is not a function of x. Now let's go the other way. And now we're wanting to know, okay, is x a function of y? That means every y, if we go to any y on the y-axis, we go over and hit the graph one time, okay? Well, that's not the case here, right? If we go to y equals 2, notice it goes over and hits the graph here on the x direction and over here on the x direction. In other words, this fails the horizontal line test. So x is not a function of y. So if we're going the other way and saying, is x a function of y, we can use the horizontal line test. So this is a little different, okay? We're used to the vertical line test probably from previous classes. So this is a little different. Now on this one over here, you can see, yeah, every y corresponds to exactly one x. So this, and you can see it passes the horizontal line test. So x is a function of y. Now let's go to this one. Y was not a function of x. But notice, if we talk about the horizontal line test, it passes that. So x is a function of y. Now down here, we've got this circle, and you can see it fails the horizontal line test. So we've got a situation where this x is not a function of y and y is not a function of x. So this vertical line test, usually what we're asked is y a function of x? And when we want to make that determination, we use the vertical line test. This thing is x a function of y, we would use the horizontal line test. And that's not something we see as much.